a video to help you understand British history. Britain is located on the British Isles in northwestern Europe, bordered by the North Sea to the east, the Atlantic Ocean to the west, France across the English Channel to the south, and Iceland in the north by the Atlantic. It consists of England, Scotland, and Wales on the island of Great Britain, as well as Northern Ireland in the northeastern part of Ireland, officially known as the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. This name has been in use since Ireland gained independence in 1922. Although Britain's current territory is only over 240,000 square kilometers, it holds a special position in the entire history of human development and wields a considerable influence on the international stage and in terms of cultural soft power. More importantly, Britain was the first country to enter modern civilization, and its modernization process occurred naturally, resulting in few twists and turns and no major upheavals. By contrast, latecomers like France and Russia paid a much heavier price, while developing countries across the Third World suffered even more drastic setbacks, as they were forced into modernization. Therefore, it is particularly meaningful to understand how Britain evolved step by step, and why it was able to enter modern civilization first. In today's video, we will start from Britain's prehistoric era and go all the way to the end of the 20th century, spanning more than 2,000 years, to show you the context of British history and how British civilization and modern Britain took shape. As we all know, Chinese history is usually divided by dynasties. The Shang dynasty was followed by the Zhou dynasty, the Tang by the Song, and the Ming by the Qing. Basically, each old dynasty was violently overthrown, and a new one was built on its ruins, leading to significant differences between successive dynasties. Britain also had dynasties, but the way dynasties change was completely different from that in China. For example, Queen Elizabeth I, the last monarch of the Tudor dynasty, had no heirs, so the throne was inherited by James Stuart, King of Scotland, and the Tudor dynasty was replaced by the Stuart dynasty. Similarly, Queen Anne of the Stuart dynasty left no children, and after her death, George I, Duke of Hanover, ascended the throne, marking the end of the Stuart dynasty and the birth of the Hanoverian dynasty. Such dynastic changes occurred without war, maintaining strong continuity between dynasties, and ordinary people barely felt any difference. Therefore, in today's discussion of British history, we will not deliberately emphasize dynasties, but instead divide it into 6 periods. In the first part, we will cover the first 3 periods: the period of foreign conquest, the period of establishing institutions and territories, and the reign of Elizabeth I, spanning from the 1st century BC to the 17th century. Over these more than 1,800 years, Britain evolved from a primitive and backward tribal civilization into a major European power. In the second part, we will discuss the latter 3 periods: the English Revolution, the height of the empire, and the period of decline and restructuring, spanning from the 17th century to the end of the 20th century. During these 400 years, Britain established a global colonial system, reached the peak of its national power, and finally returned to being an ordinary European country. Without further ado, let's dive right in. First, the period of foreign conquest, from the 1st century BC to the late 12th century AD, spanning approximately 1,100 years. During these more than 1,000 years, there were 3 landmark events: the Roman conquest, the Anglo-Saxon conquest, and the Norman conquest. Let's start with the Roman conquest, which took place in 55 BC. The famous Roman general Julius Caesar led a large army from Gaul and landed at Dover in southeastern Britain, marking the beginning of the Roman conquest of the British Isles. At that time, Britain was still in the prehistoric era, with scattered primitive tribes across the island. Although the indigenous people had developed some civilizations, for example, on the plain about 100 kilometers southwest of London, there stood 5 huge trilithons, each weighing about 20 tons and standing 7.6 meters tall, arranged in a horseshoe shape. This is Stonehenge. As the largest surviving man-made stone complex in Europe, archaeologists estimate it was built about 3,500 years ago, indicating that the indigenous Britons had mastered certain architectural skills overall. However, they were relatively backward. When Caesar's army landed, the Britons were in the late tribal society, relying on agriculture or animal husbandry for their livelihood and believing in primitive religions. with only loose political organizations. Therefore, the Roman conquest was not smooth and lasted for more than a century. It was not until 47 AD, when Emperor Claudius of the Roman Empire occupied southern Britain, that the Romans gained a firm foothold. More than 20 years later, Agricola, the governor of Britain, conquered Wales in the southwest and, in 83 AD, also conquered surrounding islands, including the Isle of Wight and the Isle of Man. Thus, except for Scotland, which was mountainous and remote, the entire British Isles were incorporated into the territory of the Roman Empire. What did Roman rule bring to Britain? Simply put, it was an urban-centered lifestyle and cultural customs. The indigenous Britons lived a primitive and backward life with only villages and no cities, while the Roman Empire was a typical urban civilization. Therefore, Roman rule abruptly pulled Britain from tribal civilization into urban civilization, which is particularly evident in the rise of London. After the Roman Empire occupied Britain, it built city walls and stationed troops in 4 places, including London and York, and also constructed roads between them, known as Roman roads. The Romans originally intended that if there was an uprising anywhere, the army could rush to suppress it in time. Unexpectedly, the wide and smooth Roman roads instead promoted commercial and trade exchanges. Among them, London, adjacent to the River Thames and convenient for shipping, gradually developed into a commercial center, with a population of 15,000 at its peak, which was considered a large city in Europe at that time. In addition to London, the Roman Empire successively built more than 20 towns, all planned and laid out with reference to the style of Rome. For example, the center of each town was a square, with public buildings such as temples, theaters, and amphitheaters distributed around it, and shops surrounding the square. People living in the towns adopted a lifestyle almost identical to that of the Romans. Of course, this was only true for a small number of people. Most Britons still lived in villages, relying on farming and herding for their livelihood, rarely coming into contact with Roman culture and retaining tribal customs. Thus, the Romans ruled Britain for more than 400 years, until drastic changes occurred in the 5th century. In 409 AD, the Britons drove out the Roman troops and officials, marking the end of Roman rule. However, the Britons' victory was not due to a sudden increase in their strength, but rather because they benefited from the invasion of Germanic tribes. At that time, the Roman Empire was invaded by Germanic barbarians, facing internal troubles. To resist the barbarians, the Roman legions stationed in Britain were successively transferred away, and the Britons took the opportunity to drive out the remaining Roman forces and establish their own kingdoms. But their good fortune did not last long. Soon, Britain was conquered by foreign tribes again, entering the period of Anglo-Saxon rule. The Anglo-Saxons were also a branch of the Germanic peoples, initially raiding the coastal areas of Britain as pirates. In 449 AD, a kingdom in southern Britain hired Anglo-Saxons to defend its territory against Scottish raids. However, the Anglo-Saxons turned the tables, and over 200 years, they established 7 barbarian kingdoms, known as the Heptarchy. These 7 kingdoms occupied the main part of the island of Great Britain, roughly corresponding to modern England. In fact, the name England emerged at that time, meaning the land of the Angles. Compared with Roman rule, Anglo-Saxon rule was a cultural regression, because the Anglo-Saxons were in a tribal society, with backward technology and no written language. Under their rule, Roman roads fell into disrepair, towns declined, and Britain regressed to an agricultural and pastoral economy. However, like the Germanic barbarians on the European continent, the Anglo-Saxons were attracted to one thing: Christianity. During the Roman rule, Christianity spread widely in Britain and gained a large number of believers. After the Anglo-Saxons arrived, various tribes successively converted to Christianity, and by the 7th century, all the rulers and subjects of the 7 kingdoms had accepted Christianity. Why did Christianity have such great appeal? There are 2 main reasons: the transformation of identity and the needs of royal power. First, the transformation of identity. The Anglo-Saxons were once nomads, with no fixed abode and believing in primitive religions. After occupying Britain, they began to transition from a nomadic society to a settled agricultural society. Primitive religions could no longer adapt to the new social form or meet people's spiritual needs. At this time, Christianity's teachings about heaven and hell were particularly appealing. Second, the needs of royal power. Originally, the Anglo-Saxons practiced military democracy, where the relationship between the chieftain and his subordinates was relatively equal, and the chieftain's power was far from that of a king. But after the establishment of kingdoms, chieftains became kings and had a demand for centralization. At this time, the value of Christianity became apparent. Christianity opposed violence, emphasized a stable social order, and required believers to obey royal power. Moreover, the coronation ceremony performed by the Roman Catholic Church for monarchs could endow them with divine nature, distinguishing them from their subjects, which was certainly pleasing to monarchs. Thus, with the help of Christianity, Britain, or more precisely, the region of England, officially entered the era of monarchy. After centuries of conquest, by the early 10th century, the Wessex dynasty, the strongest among the 7 kingdoms, had almost unified England. However, the subsequent Norman conquest turned the page of history. In 1066, William, Duke of Normandy, led an army across the English Channel to claim the throne of England. Some may ask, Normandy, located in northern France today, was a duchy established by the Danes, separated from England by the English Channel. So how did he come to claim the throne? This is because William claimed that Edward, king of the Wessex dynasty, had promised him the throne before his death, since Edward had no heirs. But this was only William's one-sided claim with no conclusive evidence. Therefore, after Edward's death, the nobles of the Wessex dynasty elected Harold, the brother of Edward the Queen, as king. William was furious, accusing the English of breaking their promise, and thus sent troops to conquer England. It must be said that William was extremely lucky. Before he even dispatched his army, the Norwegians invaded England first. 3 days later, William's army landed in southern England, and Harold hastily marched south. As a result, at the Battle of Hastings, Harold's army was defeated by William's troops, who had been resting and waiting. Thus, the Wessex dynasty fell, the Norman dynasty rose, and Britain entered the period of Norman rule. However, the Norman dynasty did not last long, less than 90 years. The reason was that after the death of Stephen, the 4th king, his cousin Henry II ascended the throne and renamed the dynasty the Plantagenet dynasty, marking its beginning. Nevertheless, the Norman dynasty had a profound impact on British history, mainly reflected in 2 aspects: the expansion of territory and the introduction of feudalism. First, the expansion of territory. William himself was the Duke of Normandy, and after his death, successive English kings also held the title of Duke of Normandy and exercised sovereignty over vast lands surrounding Normandy. On the one hand, this made Britain a major European power spanning the English Channel. On the other hand, it deeply involved Britain in French political affairs, making it an obstacle to French unification and laying the foundation for the subsequent 100 Years' War between Britain and France. Second, the introduction of feudalism. After conquering England, to reward the knights who had distinguished themselves in battle, William introduced European feudalism. The specific practice was that the king owned all the land in the country, which was then in fief to knights. Knights had the right to possess and use the fiefs, which they could enjoy for life and pass on to their descendants, on the condition that they swore allegiance to the king and served him for generations. Thus, feudal aristocrats emerged in Britain. Over time, the aristocrats' ownership of land became increasingly consolidated, and the king could no longer easily seize it, giving the aristocrats the capital and courage to oppose the king. That brings us to the first period of British history. Now, let's move on to the second period, the establishment of institutions and territories. This period spanned more than 400 years, from the early 13th century to the 1630s. And it was during this time that Britain's basic political system and territorial boundaries were established. As we mentioned earlier, by virtue of their status as Dukes of Normandy, successive English kings held territories in France. However, when King John I came to the throne in the early 13th century, with the decline of British politics and the meddling of King Philip of France, England's territories in France continued to shrink. What particularly grieved the English was the loss of Normandy in 1204, earning John I the nickname John Lackland. To save face, John I actively expanded his military and formed an alliance with the Holy Roman Empire, the Count of Flanders, the Count of Holland, and others, attempting to defeat France. But all these initiatives required a great deal of money. To this end, John I began to amass wealth frantically plundering church property and raising taxes sharply, including customs duties, personal property taxes, and inheritance taxes. At that time, the main taxpayers were the aristocrats, and the tax increases seriously damaged their interests, naturally triggering strong dissatisfaction. In 1213, the aristocrats held a meeting at St. Paul's Cathedral in London to protest against John I's actions. Since most of the participants were barons, this incident was known as the Barons' Revolt. A year later, the Allied forces were defeated by the French army, shattering John I's dream of revival and wasting a great deal of money, giving the protesters even more reason to act. In the spring of 1215, the barons launched an uprising in Stamford, and the situation quickly escalated. The rebel army marched on London, and not only did many of England's great nobles defect to support the uprising, but the barons also received strong support from King Philip of France. Trapped in internal and external difficulties, John I compromised. On June 19, 1215, he signed an agreement with the baronial representatives, agreeing to accept aristocratic supervision and restrain his power. This agreement was the Magna Carta. In terms of its origin, the Magna Carta was a product of the aristocrats' efforts to safeguard their own interests. At that time, there were only a few hundred aristocrats in England, so the Magna Carta only benefited a very small number of people, and ordinary people did not gain anything from it. However, the two principles it established had far-reaching implications. The first principle was that the king could only levy taxes with the consent of a great council composed of aristocrats, which was the prototype of the British Parliament. During the reign of King Edward I, the Great Council gradually gained legislative power. By the late 13th century, citizens could also attend Parliament as local representatives, breaking the aristocrats' monopoly on Parliament. Since then, no taxation without representation has become a consensus across England, and it can be said that the Magna Carta laid the foundation for Britain's parliamentary system. The second principle was that if the king ruled tyrannically, he would break the contract between the monarch and his subjects, and the subjects had the right to resist to protect their property and personal safety. More than 400 years later, Parliament relied on this principle to turn against King Charles I, leading to the outbreak of the English Revolution. The 17th century British thinker John Locke argued in his classic work *The Treatises of Government* that people have the right to resist tyrannical rule, and the theoretical source of this argument also comes from the Magna Carta. John Locke believed that the greatest significance of the Magna Carta was that it initiated the British tradition that royal power must be restricted and the king must abide by the law. It can be said that the Magna Carta laid the foundation for Britain's basic political system and set Britain, which adopted a limited monarchy, on a different path from France and Spain, which practiced absolute monarchy. Of course, English kings were unwilling to have their power restricted. Capable monarchs like Edward I, Edward III, and Henry V always wanted to restore their authority, and the continuous wars during this period helped them because wars usually favor centralization. From the late 13th century to the mid-15th century, over 200 years, the English were busy fighting wars, which can be divided into internal and external conflicts. First, internal wars, that is, the conquest of other regions on the British Isles. In 1282, Edward I marched into Wales and completely conquered it 2 years later. To celebrate, he appointed his newborn son Edward II as the Prince of Wales, and since then, the heir to the British throne has held this title. For example, Prince Charles' official title is actually the Prince of Wales. In 1296, the Scottish Wars of Independence broke out. At the Battle of Stirling Bridge, the Scottish national hero William Wallace led the rebels to inflict a heavy defeat on the English army. In 1305, Wallace was defeated and captured, and Edward I executed him for treason. The Hollywood director Mel Gibson's film Braveheart depicts this period of history. Although Wallace died, he inspired the Scots. The Scottish Wars of Independence lasted for more than half a century, imposing a heavy financial burden on England. In the end, Scotland still gained independence, making England's efforts futile. Scotland finally agreed to form the Kingdom of Great Britain with England in the 18th century. In addition to external conquest, England was also unstable internally. From 1455 to 1471, the House of York and the House of Lancaster fought fiercely over the succession to the throne. Since the House of York used a white rose as its emblem, and the House of Lancaster red rose, this conflict is known as the Wars of the Roses. In the end, the two sides compromised. Henry VII of the House of Lancaster married Elizabeth of the House of York, ending the war. Next, external wars, mainly the 100 Years' War between Britain and France. As we mentioned earlier, England lost Normandy in the early 13th century, but still retained an enclave on the European continent Gascony in southwestern France. English kings attached great importance to Gascony and were unwilling to give it up easily for two reasons. First, with Gascony in hand, the English king's rule was not limited to Britain. There was even the possibility of reclaiming Normandy and seeking greater interests on the European continent. Second, Gascony was an important trade hub. British textiles and grain were shipped to all parts of the world through Gascony. And Gascony's prosperous industry and commerce brought the English king an annual income of £17,000, a huge sum for a king whose right to tax was restricted by Parliament. But for France, the situation was different. From the 13th century onwards, the Capetian dynasty of France began to unify the country, and French national consciousness gradually awakened. Gascony, controlled by England, was regarded by the French as the biggest obstacle to unification. Conflicts between the two sides continued, and finally, in 1328, they stepped on a landmine. That year, King Charles IV of France died without leaving a male heir, and the French nobles crowned Philip VI, Count of Valois, as king. But King Edward III of England raised an objection, claiming that as Charles IV's nephew, he had French royal blood and was more entitled to the throne than Philip VI, an outsider. Philip VI naturally scoffed at this. Thus, in 1337, Edward III proclaimed himself King of France and led an army to invade France. Marking the outbreak of the war, the two countries fought and negotiated and fought, lasting from 1337 to 1453, a total of 116 years. Britain had the upper hand in the early stages of the war, reclaiming Normandy and even occupying Paris at one point. But later France gradually turned the tide and drove the British out completely. Therefore, the direct consequence of the 100 Years' War was that Britain withdrew from the European continent and became a purely island nation. From this perspective, Britain suffered heavy losses. On the other hand, the 100 Years' War also aroused British nationalism and propelled Britain toward becoming a nation-state, which was particularly evident in religious affairs. According to the medieval religious system, Catholic clergy were appointed by the Pope in Rome and had to obey the Roman Curia, and Britain was no exception. Later, as France's influence grew, the Curia moved to Avignon in southern France for a period, and several popes were French. At that time, Britain and France were at war, so the Pope naturally favored his home country, which greatly angered the British. In 1351, Edward III announced the expulsion of foreign clergy, stating that only the Church of England would have the right to appoint clergy in the future. During the reign of Henry VIII, the Church of England completely broke with the Roman Curia. In 1536, Henry VIII persuaded Parliament to pass the Act of Restraint of Appeals, abolishing the Pope's right to interfere in British religious affairs. In 1559, Elizabeth I, Henry VIII's daughter, prompted Parliament to pass the Act of Supremacy and the Act of Uniformity, declaring the English monarch as the supreme governor of the Church of England. This move marked that the British had completely broken away from external influence in the cultural and spiritual fields and embarked on a path of independent development. That brings us to the second period of British history. Now, let's move on to the third period, the reign of Elizabeth I. This period spanned 44 years, from Elizabeth's ascension to the throne in 1558 until her death. Elizabeth I is regarded as one of the greatest monarchs in British history. During her reign, Britain achieved brilliant achievements in economy, foreign expansion, and culture, truly growing into a major European power. First, economic development. Before Elizabeth ascended the throne, the enclosure movement had begun in Britain. The cause was the rise in prices of wool and meat in the 16th century. To seek greater profits, Squires and aristocrats seized farmers' land through various means, and converted it into large pastures to raise more profitable cattle and sheep. This led to a large number of farmers losing their land and becoming homeless. However, the enclosure movement objectively promoted the prosperity of industry and commerce to survive. A large number of landless farmers flocked to the textile industry, tripling Britain's textile exports. After ascending the throne, Elizabeth adopted a mercantilist policy. On the one hand, she imposed high tariffs to prevent textiles from the European continent from entering the British market. On the other hand, she introduced various preferential measures to support the domestic textile industry. Coupled with technological progress, the production efficiency of Britain's textile industry improved significantly, and British textiles were sold to various countries in Europe, making the textile industry Britain's pillar industry. At the same time, the sugar industry, glass industry, coal industry, and metallurgy industry also developed rapidly. According to statistics, 22% of British aristocrats owned iron-making factories, gradually making Britain the manufacturing center of Europe and laying a solid foundation for the subsequent Industrial Revolution. Next, for an expansion, Elizabeth mainly did two things: defeating Spain and overseas colonization. And these two things were highly interconnected. Why did Britain go to war with Spain at that time? This can be traced back to the Reformation. In 1568, Elizabeth imprisoned Mary, Queen of Scots, to prevent her from conspiring to seize the British throne. This move angered Pope Pius V, who excommunicated Elizabeth and called on Catholics to oppose her. But Elizabeth was not to be messed with. In 1571, she announced that Britain would abandon Catholicism and convert to Protestantism, which further angered Catholics, including King Philip II of Spain. Philip II was a devout Catholic who regarded eradicating heretics as his mission. He was furious at Britain's betrayal and vowed to restore Catholicism in Britain. In addition, he had very realistic considerations. Since the late 15th century, Spain had acquired vast colonies in the Americas. Gold, sugar, cotton, and spices from the Americas flowed into Spain continuously, making it the most powerful country in Europe. After Elizabeth ascended the throne, Britain also began to colonize the Americas, which brought it into conflict with Spain. Unprepared to confront Spain head-on, the British resorted to piracy, plundering Spanish merchant ships and causing huge losses to Spain. Philip II had long been dissatisfied and had been looking for an opportunity to resolve this issue. Therefore, in 1587, after Elizabeth executed Mary, Queen of Scots, King Philip II of Spain took the opportunity to declare war. At that time, Spain had the most powerful naval force in Europe, the Spanish Armada, so Philip II was full of confidence. But the result was unexpected. In the Battle of Gravelines, the British Navy defeated the Spanish Armada, and the subsequent Atlantic hurricane destroyed the main ships of the Armada, leaving Spain with no chance of a comeback. Subsequently, Britain took the initiative to launch several expeditions to the Americas, seizing vast territories from Spain. In addition to the Americas, Britain also expanded its colonial activities to South Asia. In 1600, Queen Elizabeth granted a royal charter to the East India Company, giving it a monopoly on trade with India. This marked the beginning of Britain's colonization of India, which later became Britain's most important overseas colony. With a beaming economy and fruitful foreign expansion, Britain's national strength continued to grow. In 1600, the population of London, Britain's capital, reached 200,000, making it the largest city in Europe. Britain thus became a true major European power, and the British people's national confidence soared. British culture then entered a period of prosperity, with William Shakespeare being the most representative figure. Shakespeare was born in 1564 in the town of Stratford-upon-Avon in England. He went to London at the age of 28 and became a master playwright with his extraordinary talent. His classic masterpieces, such as A Midsummer Night's Dream, The Merchant of Venice, and Hamlet, were all created during Elizabeth's reign. Thanks to Shakespeare, Britain was able to stand alongside France and Italy as a cultural power. However, history does not develop in a straight line. During the more than 40 years of Elizabeth's reign, although Britain rose from a small country to a major European power, it did not continue to progress. Instead, it entered a long period of turmoil. This is the English Revolution, which we will discuss in the next video, along with the subsequent height of the empire and the period of decline and restructuring. Well, due to time constraints, that's all for the first part of British history. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.